Hi, everybody. Welcome to the October meeting of the Equal Access Book Club. When the Guide to Assisting Students with Disabilities, Equal Access in Health Science and Professional Education was published in 2015, it filled a gap for those of us involved with the education of students with disabilities in the health sciences. Since then, so much more has been written about students with disabilities and accommodations, and we're excited to bring you this new book that reviews the second edition.
So today we're covering Chapter 10, Debunking Myths and Addressing Legitimate Concern, by our own Elisa Laird, who's here with us from ahead as kind of our go-to person in keeping us sane during this meeting. Also Timothy Montgomery and our coalition president, Lisa Meeks.
Before we get started, let's tell you a little bit about ourselves. I'm Christine Lowe. I'm the Director of Disability Services for the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and I've served on the Coalition for Disability Access in Health Sciences Board since 2016, first as the treasurer and now as the secretary.
And my name is Joe Murray. I'm an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City. Christine and I are just a 30 blocks away or so on the Upper East Side, although in COVID, we've been a lot further apart. And I've also been involved with this coalition since around 2014, 15, when I first met Lisa Meeks when I was an Associate Dean of Student Affairs at Weill Cornell. It was really trying to understand disability and accommodation, and she was a wonderful partner to sort of help me along. And I've been on the board. I've stepped off now, having completed my term, but was secretary of the board of directors for the coalition. So this second edition of the book Equal Access for Students with Disabilities wouldn't exist without our fantastic editors, Lisa Meeks, Neera Jain, and Elisa Laird. And there are many others who've contributed to this book. We're grateful to all of the authors who are listed on this slide for their time and their talents.
And the Equal Access Book Club would not exist without the support of several key groups. AHEAD, the Association for Higher Education and Disability. Their assistance in the Zoom platform has been invaluable during these meetings. The Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education. Designated interpreters who are doing our captioning today. And Springer Publications, our publisher. We're grateful for their support of this novel way to explore the second edition of Equal Access for Students with Disabilities.
So some guidelines for today's book discussion. As moderators, our roles are to pose some questions based on the 10th chapter of the book and to facilitate a discussion. We've both moderated these before, and we've also been attendees. And we are really just, both Christine and I are just grateful for the groups that have emerged in these meetings for creating such rich discussions. We've really been appreciative of how civil and respectful the discussions have been, and really how encouraging and supportive of each other as we all navigate perspectives of the members of our audience so that we can learn from one another and grow as a community.
So the best way to engage in the discussion on Zoom is by using that raise hand function. If you do that, we will call on you and unmute you so you can speak and we can engage in that rich discussion. If you don't want to raise your hand, another option is to post a comment in the chat, or we would encourage you to put questions for the moderators in the Q&A feature. We would love to hear from as many who are comfortable joining in and sharing your thoughts, experiences, and wisdom. And to encourage participation, you probably already know by now, but everybody who actively participates in the meeting by posing a question or a comment is going to be entered into a drawing for a free book. And we're keeping track of who participates, and there'll be a random drawing at the conclusion of the book club meetings. So don't forget to participate. Let's get started.
Question one, discuss the following statement and provide some supporting reasons why this statement is untrue. Students with disabilities cannot fulfill the rigorous requirements of health science programs.
Joe, I can't imagine that all of our participants are this shy. Surely somebody has as strong of feelings about that statement as I do.
I totally agree. If anyone is comfortable to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can help us with this myth and how we might engage in a dialogue with someone who says this. Terry Edwards, let's.
I'll put out a few thoughts. And I think this statement comes from individuals who have not had the exposure of how the conclusion of a program, the participation in the health science program can be done differently. And it doesn't necessarily have to be totally hands-on. Completing an activity by instructing someone else how to do it seems to blow a lot of people's minds.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. It's kind of that old mindset about, the old way is the only way. Other thoughts, comments?
We have some comments in the chat, and if anyone is also comfortable to sort of feel free to raise your hand, and we can unmute you. Let's go to Maria Keller, who raised her hand. And we'll go to talk. Maria, let's see. Oh, you're still mute. Lisa, can you try that again? I think you and I both try to unmute her at the same time.
Hello, am I unmuted?
Oh, thank you. Yes, Maria. Yep.
Yay. Okay, so when I see the statement, it feels so arrogant. So taking emotions out of it, it is just really, it is so untrue, because just like Christine said, the old way is not the only way. And I mean, medicine, health sciences is such an evolving field, and technology brings so much more access and diversity as to how things get done. So students with disabilities can fulfill the rigorous requirements just by looking at alternate, more creative ways, and sometimes even more like advancing the field by having to be creative. So.
Great, Maria. Erica Levy in the chat mentioned something similar, that students with disabilities do have the opportunity to receive accommodations so that they can be successful everywhere. Will Pines noted that students graduate each term in this field and are successful. Brian Hilbert had raised his hand. Let's unmute you, Brian, if you're willing to talk.
Sure. I just wanted to say something that I repeat often in situations on my campus. I say assumption is the mother of discrimination, right? If you're making a determination about somebody and what they can and cannot do without taking a look at both sides, right? Their actual strengths and challenges and the actual needs of specific courses and assignments and programs, you're making assumptions. And if you get too many assumptions together, you'll get into a really dark place. And not only is that not good for students, but it's not good for compliance.
A great point, Brian.
Barb Statfield. Let me unmute you.
All right. On the flip side, prior to becoming involved with disability services here at Highland Community College, I had a daughter that my husband and I had adopted that had significant disabilities. And I would be remiss to say that I was truly grateful that her primary doctor was a wheelchair user and had multiple sclerosis. And I felt that she was more qualified due to that than less qualified because of her disability, because she certainly knew more of what my daughter was going through than our normal, in quotes, types of doctors. So, from that standpoint, just from the other side of that, as being a patient or parent of a patient, truly takes that myth and kind of throws it out the window.
Rana Nash mentioned representation is huge. We have a call-in user. Let me unmute you. Oh, whoops, let me see. Oops, no. Sorry, that I think you unraised your hand. Anyone else further thoughts?
Brian, I don't know if you saw in the chat, but one of our participants is gonna take your term. She said, I'm writing that down.
Yeah, the idea also of, again, and Barb sort of spoke to this, the idea of having a field of providers, healthcare providers, who represent the wide realm of humanity, including people with disabilities, and just sort of what an inspiring thing that is, and what knowledge that provides, and how providers with disabilities and students with disabilities can share that knowledge with their colleagues. That representation is huge. Quote,
Yeah, I think that rich experience, that rich lived experience, you know, of having lived with a disability or being close with someone who has a disability and going through that with them, I think really furthers, right, the knowledge base and our understanding of different elements of the human condition.
Michelle Juarez early on mentioned something that'll segue into case number 2, and nailed it about this idea of students with disabilities don't have a place in healthcare professions. She wrote this part. It obviously did not engage in an interactive process. It can't have all or nothing denial. So let's move to case number 2.
All right, let's do question 2. An interactive process with the student is necessary to determine a combination plan that appropriately addresses a student's access barriers. What steps must a DRP go through before deciding that an accommodation is not possible? And then a second question for that is, what documentation must be kept?
Anyone want to kick us off here?
For those of you who do this in the field, what's the beginning? What do you start with when somebody comes to you and asks for an accommodation? Looks like Brian raised his hand. Oh,
Let me go with Megan Matthews, and then
okay.
I'll go to Brian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Megan Matthews. I'm at UW Seattle, University of Washington, Seattle, and I'm still a little new to the health science realm, but I think for me, what I've seen throughout the last year and a half with this is when I meet with a student, it's really gathering their self-report. So taking in what's on their documentation, but also hearing from them directly because they're living it on a day-to-day basis. So they're going to often have more insight than what's written. And so typically I just try to hear as much as I can about what are the barriers, what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past. And then for me, what I'm learning is, which I will never get to expert level on this, but really trying to have an understanding of what students are being assessed on, or what are the technical standards of each program, and then meeting with the program to first say, like, how do you assess this? Like, what is being required? Is it more about them physically doing something versus their knowledge of it? To try to identify if accommodations can even be implemented. And so often that's several conversations and bringing in different people around the table to get a better understanding of that. So I would say before deciding whether it's possible or not, it always takes needing to meet with the people in the program who have created those technical standards or created those requirements or the curriculum, and figuring out if there's other ways we can make it work. Like, what are some creative opportunities that we have to give the student the access they need and to show it in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great points. Does anybody want to add to that?
It's Brian. I think I would take a bit of a different starting place, and I really look at the documentation and the student report with almost equal weighting, right? So, so what is this person's, the limitations observed either by a qualified medical professional or assessed through, psychoeducational evaluation or something else, and taking that and saying, does that match up with their self-report and their history of disability? Because they're coming into a brand new experience, especially in health sciences, right? They don't know what it's like to be a nursing student or a medical student. They're going to be entering, something for the first time. But if I can go back to those hard skills, then I can help them and talk about what challenges might look like. And on the other side of it, on our institution side, I try to get our faculty and program partners to see that you have to earn the no. So we're going to have a philosophy of yes and accommodation unless you can demonstrate that it really shouldn't be done. And I think coming in with that really helps folks, right? And so if they know that they're going to have to earn the no, then part of that is gathering the information and saying, are there other ways nationally that people are successfully accommodating, and can we make that part of our program?
Great point, Brian. Looks like Maria raised her hand. Joe, is that right?
Hey, Maria, I'll unmute you. Sorry, I missed that.
No worries. I think I want to add to what Brian said is like, yes, getting the student report is great. Reviewing the documentation to see if it matches what the student is sharing and if the experience is accurate to what their limitations are. But then we have to also include the third part of the interactive process, which is looking into the program, the expectations,
Hey, little one.
The learning objectives, the technical standards.
How are you?
And then once we can look at all that, it's like we can identify what accommodation can get to the student being able to meet the technical standards without altering the course of study or minimizing it or fundamentally altering what the student is supposed to be proving competency with. So before we can decide an accommodation is not possible, we have to really assess, is a patient going to be at risk? Is the learning objective really being measured? It's yes, looking at the paperwork, looking at the student experience, but also looking at the program and the requirements. So yeah, we need to be able to, and sometimes that includes a lot of consultation with the program itself. So it's a pretty involved process, especially if we're going to say no. And the documentation and all the information you gathered to be able to support the decision to prove that you really engaged in a full interactive process. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. I think that kind of goes back to what Megan was talking about, pulling others in from the program, from the folks who wrote the technical standards, the folks who decided what the essential elements or essential requirements were, pulling all those folks into the conversation and going, like Maria described, going through that whole process with everybody and then documenting that whole process really carefully, as Maria said. Other thoughts or comments from anybody?
And that also fits in with, as Brian had said, if you start with a philosophy of yes, you then have to, as I think he phrased it, you have to earn the no, which is if you're going to say no, you really have to work hard. You have to exhaust all options. You have to really explore things and realize that they're not possible before you're able to say no. That's an interesting approach.
Yeah, I loved that. I love that starting point, earn the no. I think, Brian, a lot of us are going to use your sayings. I'm going to go back to my faculty with that one. That was a good one.
Can we get a collection of Hilbert aphorisms that we can, that could be a prize at the end. I appreciate it. And the comments as well. It's great from all of you guys. Maria kind of hinted at, we don't have these plants in the audience, but Maria kind of pointed us to the next topic. So why don't we migrate over to that, which is discuss how you might respond to a clinical faculty member who believes that providing accommodations to students with disabilities compromises patient safety? Maria? If I unmuted you. Go ahead, Maria. Are you able to talk?
Yeah, I didn't even realize I had pressed that. So
You know what? That may have been your previous hand raised.
okay.
You're welcome to talk. Or anyone else wanna? How do you talk to a clinical faculty member who thinks that just even having a student who has accommodations or a student with disabilities is going to compromise patient safety? There are some hands raised. Let me see. Let me move down.
I can. I mean, I've been talking, so I'll let somebody else speak.
Michelle Juarez.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I would just start by acknowledging that, this is a big conversation, a lot to unpack. So oftentimes it's best to invite the faculty member to meet one-on-one, whether that be virtually or a phone call, to discuss any questions they have rather than just a direct email. But a good starting place is to cite back to a lot of the published research, the book that we're just discussing now, and share and benchmark and share really best practices, and that this is something that does take place, not just in our bubble, in our own school, but across the country. And then go from there with maybe some training materials.
That's fantastic, Michelle. Call-in user? I just unmuted you. Maybe not.
Hi there. This is Laura, and I successfully unmuted.
We can hear you, Laura. Welcome.
Oh, good. Thank you. And I really appreciate this kind of relational approach that Michelle brought up of, making it a conversation. My initial response is nausea, or just like, this visceral response of why are we always questioning disabled folks' safety? And so taking that step back for me is important of, okay, taking an inquisitive and curious approach to the faculty member, and exploring with them why they have this perception of disability being a risk to safety of patients or clients. And I think that has been a helpful approach in my experience of inquiry and calling people in to a different conversation, even though my visceral response is to call them out on ableism, but to take that inquisitive approach, I think has been really helpful in my experience.
I love
I'll
that.
stop there and invite others.
Yeah, I really love that approach, because at the end of the day, if you're working with the faculty, you want to maintain those relationships. So really kind of hearing from them, what their concerns are, exploring those with them, and then hopefully being able to educate them. Like you said, while you kind of maybe bite the inside of your cheek and hesitate and stop yourself from just calling them out.
Yeah, Laura, the idea, I love the idea of calling someone in. The image is just so wonderful. Come in. I want to hear your perspective, and then sort of invite them to a dialogue, I think works very nicely, and it builds upon what Michelle had said. Michelle, your hand is still raised. Do you want to add more, or should I not unraise it?
I lowered my hand, thank you.
Okay, all right. I will say, in my experience with faculty, I come at this not as a disability resource provider. I've been in the student affairs role and sort of trying to talk to faculty about some of their preconceived notions. I know it's a very simplistic approach, and it doesn't fully honor the lived experiences of people with disabilities. But I will use the eyeglass example often because so many medical providers are wearing eyeglasses, or have contact lenses, or have had eye surgery. I'm just looking at sort of face pictures of people on any Zoom meeting I go to, and everybody has glasses on. And the idea of just inviting someone to think about, you're wearing glasses and you're able to sort of function and do well. Just how would life be if you didn't have those glasses? You still have the knowledge, you still have a lot of the wisdom, you still have a lot of the insights, but how is it when you're not able to see sort of the way you do? And for a lot of us with eyeglasses, it's the reading, it's the difficulty reading. So how is it if you have a disability where you're not able to read, and or that reading is very challenging? And we have a way to accommodate that. We even use the word accommodation to describe coming up with the right lens prescription. It's figuring out what that accommodation is. So we have an accommodation that works, that allows you who has this impairment at baseline that is substantially limiting potentially some areas of your functioning to now be able to function well. We in the disabilities world and all the people who've been doing research in this have been coming up with very inventive, creative, innovative ways of accommodating people in ways that allow them to participate. And that brain that's there is able to function and do good work. And sometimes that gets them. Not always, I have to say, but that's my attempt at calling someone in, I think. Laura, your hands. Is that Laura? Are you still on? Your hand is raised, but
sorry, I'm just stretching.
Okay.
I can't actually take my hand down from the phone. I don't know how. I
think I could do that. I'm gonna lower hand. That's my new command. Lower hand. I can push a button.
Mercy.
I wish I had that power in real life. Other thoughts?
I'll just add quickly that, while you're bringing people in and inquiring about what their concerns are, I think one helpful way to kind of frame that conversation is also based in that legislation, right? There's rules that have to be followed about to be in compliance, to be able to say that there's a patient safety issue. So again, being able to kind of educate them as we move along. Is it a real threat? Is it based on current medical knowledge? Is it, how likely is this to happen? And kind of taking them through some of those steps as you're having that conversation with them, I think helps them to understand a little better, the perspective that we might be coming from, right? Again, kind of just debunking those myths and those misconceptions and those preconceptions about what somebody might or might not be able to do. So I find that that's a helpful way sometimes to I love Joe's example, and I think that it's a kind of a helpful way to frame that conversation as you're talking with people who are coming from that perspective.
I think also is when we think about patient safety, we also think about the universal design approach and how there's so many things in the system already in place to try to maximize patient safety and minimize errors. And so that's, I think when we think about students with disabilities, and the book has some good examples of scenarios of potential, someone with a seizure disorder or dyslexia, seizure disorder, sort of having a seizure in the OR, dyslexia, doing pharmacy, filling the right prescriptions. There are universal design prospects that allow for the safety of a patient if anyone passes out in the emergency room, and that there are universal design processes that work on ensuring that the right prescription is filled. So I think thinking about that is helpful as well.
Is there another hand raised?
Actually,
or am I still seeing Laura?
Yeah,
it's Laura.
I put my hand up again.
Go ahead.
I think something that I'd be interested in exploring as well is, I think as disabled folks and some folks in the community who have accessed the system, say, you know what, I don't feel very safe being with a clinician who has this ableist approach. So in some ways, for some folks, working with a disabled clinician is actually enhances patient safety or client safety. So that I think is an interesting way of flipping the script of, you know, what extra work do non-disabled folks need to do in order to be safe with patients. And so that kind of just flips that script on its head. And yeah, so I don't know if that made sense, but if it didn't, I can keep talking, but there you go.
That made a lot of sense to me, and it ties into this movement that really has been flourishing in the last few years of health service providers, physicians, nurses, all health professionals sharing their lived experience of being a health professional with a disability and what that has entailed, what, you know, how they got there, what their experience is, and how it has been helpful for working with their patients or clients. So I think that's such a key point on this topic, Laura.
I'm curious if folks have thoughts on how we can engage in flipping that script. Yeah, if folks have any ideas around that.
Kelly shared that I tell my students that a lot of being vulnerable about their disability to their patients can bring a stronger rapport in that doctor-patient relationship.
Studio commented on thinking about different disability models and how much the medical model of disability influence or perpetuates this point of view. Studio, I had to say it, so just FYI. I didn't sing it though, so.
So should we move on to question 4?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, so using evidence presented in the chapter, explain in your own words why this statement is untrue. Accommodations in the clinical setting do not prepare the students for the real world. I know you guys have thoughts and feelings about this statement.
Laura?
Joe, I think you skipped us ahead.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. You know, I'm trying to, let's see. Sorry about that. I'm trying to navigate 3 different boxes here. Actually, Ron and Ash mentioned life is an accommodation. I love that. Laura, did you want to say something?
No, my hand was just still up again.
Okay.
But I'm happy to talk about it. But I am even more happy to hear from some others who haven't talked as much as I do.
Well, Maria shared in the chat that the real world has accommodations.
Yep.
And that's another example of when healthcare providers with disabilities share their experiences, that sort of acknowledges that, yes, the real world, we can function in the real world for these reasons. We have one other hand. Let me see. Sorry, I'm paging. Andrea Gonzalez?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this is a statement that I have heard in the past, and to me, just even utilizing real world, I feel like we are in the real world. What the student, the learners are experiencing right now is clearly going to influence the future of their profession. So I think the accommodations and the process and everything they encounter now, it's the preparation stage for that, professional setting that they're going to be encountering once they graduate from their programs. And as some of the other individuals have mentioned, there are accommodations in the professional setting through the ADA, and there are many other federal agencies and other groups that provide a great amount of guidance in terms of how to navigate that process. But yeah, my biggest thing, when I encounter these conversations, is just focusing that we are in the education realm of the aspect, and that although I do appreciate the concern for their professional goals, I'm more, I want to prioritize what the student is experiencing in the moment as a learner in that particular educational context and setting, and how can we maximize and enhance accessibility in this season of their education, and then continue to prepare them as, they graduate and beyond.
Nicely said.
Laura?
Yeah, I think that's a good and important point, is thinking about that this is a time of learning. And so I've been talking with some of my students, or some of the students with whom I work as well, when they've been hesitant, like, oh, I don't want to have accommodations because, like, oh, what is it going to be like when I'm in practice? And I think another one of the important and helpful pieces has been to talk about, like, when you are in learning, you have this big cognitive load that is involved in learning. And so for some of these pieces, like, you might need extra time right now to do your documentation. And you might not need that extra time later, because some of your brain space, so to speak, will be opened up, because you won't be so have so much of a cognitive load around learning. And B, you might be able to just have that extra time because you can design your practice to a way that works best for you. So I think that's been helpful to have kind of those couple different perspectives on why the fact that this is a learning time is so different than practice time, because A, it's less flexible, and B, you have this bigger cognitive load at this point in time because you are learning so much. Not that you'll stop learning, but you're particularly learning a lot right now.
Great points, Laura. Brian also added in the chat that every time we have evaluated the real world placements, we find that the real world is very flexible, especially for doctors.
I've heard the argument many years ago about even just accommodations of added time on exam, because the real world is that students are going to have a hard time getting added time on step one. And this is many years ago, and things have gotten a bit better, although not great. But particularly students who hadn't had accommodations prior to coming to medical school, particularly the added time on exams, and how the NBME in my era of student affairs, which is 2013 to 2017, just routinely rejected students out of hand for added time. And I'd get faculty saying, well, the real world is they're not going to be able to get this added time. The truth is that regardless of that, the student has to be able to learn, and the student needs the accommodations to learn. As Laura points out, once they're able to learn better, that frees up some mental space for them. I think a lot of it is just the knowledge of obstacles rather than a supportive group that's trying to help you engage in learning that frees up some of your mental energy to do other things. And we're very good about sort of appropriately giving accommodations that were due in students who need it at a time because they never had the type of learning experience that they had in the first semester of medical school, where you're nowhere in your life except from elementary school are you sitting down for 6 to 8 hours a day as a sponge and trying to learn as much as you can. And kids are sort of designed to do that. They do it really well for the most part. Adults don't. And so it's an artificial environment that bears no resemblance to your clinical world down the road, that you're being put in a place where you're actually floundering, and with a lifeline of accommodations you can do well. So I think people will even use in the real world to even include testing in even their third year of school or whatever. Well, in that world, this will never work, and that's not the appropriate way to think about things. And I appreciate the perspectives people have shared on this. It's really good.
Looks like we might have some more raised hands.
Maria.
And I think there's one more thing I'd like to add. Because I've worked with many medical students that part of the reason why we're looking at accommodations is because their functional limitations may not be a good match to a current rotation, but that's not what they want to specialize on. So in the real world of their profession, they may not even need accommodations, but the breadth of knowledge and experiences while they're in medical school is so wide that they're set up to demonstrate mastery in all these fields, but in reality, they're going to go into psychiatry. So having to do these physical tasks may not even be something that they're going to be encountering in their real world of the future. So I think keeping in mind the breadth of experience and demands is very different than what they actually want to specialize in. So.
Yeah, another excellent point, right? I have students who talk about particularly surgery rotations in that way, right? They have no interest in being a surgeon, but they have to get through their surgery rotation. And so, students, for instance, who may need the option to sit down, they're not, and they're not going to be standing at an operating table for 12 hours a day. So what can we do to facilitate them getting through their surgery rotation so that they can move on to what they do want to do for a living?
Why don't we move on to the next question? Using evidence presented in the chapter, provide at least 3 supporting reasons why this statement is untrue. Accommodations lower program standards, resulting in unqualified graduates.
Did Frank just call you? What did Frank want? Is Steve still there?
Let's see, I thought I saw Michelle. Let me find you on here, sorry.
I was able to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I love it.
Okay, great. Yes, just, as the nature of an accommodation, it's to help level the playing field and, bridge the gap in equity. It does in no way change the curriculum. And that's what I would share with our faculty if they were asking.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, the academic and technical standards are the same.
Raina says, that's a good point. No fundamental alteration. Right. And then explaining what that means to the faculty. As Joe said, it doesn't change the requirements, the essential requirements.
Laura, your hand is still raised. Do you have something to add for this?
Sorry, I still can't lower my own hand.
Oh,
You can
okay.
feel free to lower it for me though. Thank you.
I shall.
Maria added in the chat, students with disabilities are required to meet the same academic and tech standards as their peers.
Michelle Juarez? Did I unmute you?
Oh, I thought I lowered my hand. My apologies.
Oh, that's okay.
I think this is another one of those things where I think was it Laura who talked about bringing people in, right? You have to bring them into the conversation and hear their concerns and then explain it to them.
And Phil, following with what Maria had said before, this idea, and I'll just focus on the medical school perspective, the idea that a student should be able, upon graduation, to assume every single type of medical profession and engage in that level of training is just not true. People do not do every profession, and so a student who may not do as well in one specific clinical clerkship or rotation still graduates and becomes a fantastic physician. And I love the psychiatry example in the physical exam as speaking as a psychiatrist. So we do some aspects of physical exam, but not to the degree we had to when I was a med student. But that pluripotential notion that a medical school graduate should be able to do absolutely everything, when in fact no one does absolutely everything. Even that in the book, there's the example of the chiropractic student who is visually impaired and wanted to proceed, and part of chiropractic training is to be able to interpret x-rays in a way to then figure out how you're going to you do your adjustments. And in the briefings and in the court ruling, it was noted that it was like 20% of chiropractors don't even have x-ray equipment. They read x-ray reports that someone else read, and from reading that report, they then do it. And so the ability to actually read the x-ray is not a fundamental aspect of the training.
The other thing I think is ironic about this is so many times in health sciences, the students are so motivated to be superstars in every aspect of their learning and in their training, right? And they already put so much pressure on themselves in that regard. And, you know, it harkens me back. I used to work in developmental pediatrics, and it harkens me back to saying to kids, you know, everybody has stuff they're good at and everybody has stuff that's harder for them, right? And that's true when we get to be graduate students and adults also, right? So as Joe said, it's not necessarily realistic to expect that everybody's going to be a superstar across all of these different elements of their program training. You know, it's likely that you'll come across something that you're going to have to work a little harder at, or that you're going to have to struggle a little bit with.
Sorry.
All right.
Well,
should we move?
Yeah,
to
let's move to the next
6?
question. Yeah.
All right. So discuss how you might respond to a colleague who states students with disabilities cannot handle the intensity of health science programs.
Can anyone?
Amen.
Fix your program.
Raina says fire them. I don't think all of us have the ability to do that, Raina.
I will say, going on with what Laura says, you know, when you think about our health science education programs, they are tough. Everyone has challenges. Everyone has periods of time where they are not doing well. Real life intervenes, and there are times when people, you know, are not sort of able to be fully present and need some assistance to kind of get them through it. Life intervenes in that regard. So you have an incredibly hard course of study, which itself is a bit of a problem, that is often unforgiving of need for decompressing time. At a time, actually, for a lot of our learners, many of whom are in their late teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, lifelong learning, of course, but that's often, we're talking about undergraduates and graduates, and it's often in that time frame where there's so many other things going on, so many life events. And from a psychiatric perspective, the emergence of a number of psychiatric conditions that can happen in adolescence and young adulthood. So life itself is hard. All students face challenges. I've been impressed by working with students with disabilities because one of the things that many have is I've heard the phrase resilience experience. They have experience in bouncing back. They've had to be resilient throughout much of their life with their disability. And that resilience experience is kind of what you want in someone who's going to be a healthcare provider. The ability to sort of ally with a patient and sort of help them get through their challenge and know that they can. So I think, and a number of students have said this, that some aspect of their disability is also their superpower, and that's what's really kind of helped them when they sort of talk about their origin stories about becoming a healthcare professional. Maria wrote, these programs are the pressure cookers of the human condition. They are.
Again, it kind of goes back to that old school way of thinking. There's something about, especially, I don't know as much about, we have a medical school and a graduate program, but we don't have like a nursing or a dentistry school or OTPT, those kinds of things. And so I don't know as much about those programs, but in medicine in particular, there's this kind of culture of, I was tortured and I survived, so now it's my turn to torture someone else, right? And I can't figure out why we can't get past that. Like, why do we want to torture each other? And how can we educate each other and make sure that we are knowledgeable and well educated and well trained without torturing each other? It seems like that should be the priority, instead of, again, perpetuating this like pressure cooker mentality of making it as impossible and as hard as possible for every learner.
In the chat, Brian noted, we call that old school medicine. Maria?
When I'm working with students, and I work with students in PhD programs across different disciplines and the medical students, and the one thing they have in common is that they compare themselves and how they perceive how they're doing to their peers. So sometimes just reflecting back on them, it's like, you know what, it sucks for everybody. Some are just better equipped at hiding it. That sometimes just feels to them like it validates their experience. It's like, okay, so I'm not the oddball out. It's like, no, it's hard. It's lonely sometimes. It's this, and validating what they're going through can bring back the conversation of how do we survive this, instead of just dwelling on I'm sinking and no one else is. Because masking this process, I think, is part of the other part that's difficult, because so many people are so good at masking how hard it is, not just academically, but with all the pressures of life going at the same time. So yeah, I normalize the part and the fact that it is hard. And some are just better at faking it.
It makes a lot of sense, Maria, and that's so true. And I think that old school medicine that Brian talked about, valued kind of the ability to put on as good a face as possible at the price of sort of emotions, and pathologized anyone who sort of was having a bad day or was feeling sad or down. And I remember when I was a medical student, faculty saying so-and-so's behaving unprofessionally because of, not being able to keep up that mask. So it's a very bad part of our culture.
I've also seen that experience where students are comparing themselves to each other. I had a situation where a student came in and we were kind of talking about wellness and self-care. And the person said, I was going to go to the gym and I was on my way to the gym And then everybody around me was studying. And this was during dedicated time preparing for STEP exam. And she said, so instead of going to the gym, I felt this pressure to run back to my room and restart my studies. And I laughed and I said, but you don't know what any of those people were doing 5 minutes ago or 5 minutes from then, right? They all might have been out in the park, or this is pre-COVID, out in the park or in the gym themselves, or having a meal, or, having a friendly dialogue with with a friend or a colleague. You have no idea what those people were doing. And she was like, oh, I didn't think of that. It just seemed like everybody was studying all the time and that I should somehow be able to do that too.
Laura Riley in the chat noted that, these attitudes, these are very bad in a way, especially since we're now facing a future of shortages of personnel in health sciences. And Sue, sorry, let me get back up to that. Doing this from my laptop seemed so logical when I planned on it. Sue had noted, it seems normal as a medical student, perhaps because we don't know any better. There's nothing to compare the experience to, so it's hard to identify and call out unless you find yourself in a situation where you step away from the environment to gain some perspective. The mask can always be a result of how any of my classmates rescue me from drowning if they are also drowning.
Any other thoughts or comments as we're wrapping up? I noticed that we are out of time. So maybe Joe, maybe we should move on and wrap up.
Yeah, so the book club website, the bit.ly link is on the bottom there. You guys have all been sort of doing this. That's where all the questions are for each chapter.
See this information if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book. If your school or hospital library does not have this book, you might suggest that they get a copy. We believe it's a really good resource for everyone, students, faculty, and administrators.
Any last minute questions? Then I'll also share the final screen, which is just some additional resources.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and having this lively discussion. And we really appreciate your thoughts and your insights and wish everybody a really good weekend.
Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.